In the video that this comment was left on, I mentioned non-physical sexual abuse, and so this comment is basically asking if I can elaborate on that, and I'm definitely happy to. As a reminder to anybody seeing this, I'm not a therapist. I'm in therapy myself. I'm kind of a psychology nerd in general, but I'm not an expert, so take everything with a grain of salt. But yeah, a lot of us, myself included, grew up thinking that sexual abuse is basically two things. It's either like the M word that is touching, but there's not like physical invasion, I guess, or the other one, which is rape. But there is a lot of sexual abuse that doesn't have to be either of those. It can be completely non-physical. I think a couple of the more common examples, if a adult was forcing a child, or not even forcing, but just like encouraging a child to watch porn, or otherwise introducing them to explicit material. Another one would be if an adult was taking pictures of a child, of like making CSAM material of the child without actually touching them. That, of course, is a form of sexual abuse. But having the child watch you with an adult, or watch you like self-pleasure. My own experience was largely verbal sexual abuse. If you think about what would be considered sexual harassment if it happened in a workplace, statements of that nature happening to a child regularly in their home was my experience. For most of my life, I said that my stepdad was really creepy, that he was creepy to me, that he said creepy things to me. I didn't know that what I really was talking about was that he was verbally sexually abusing me, because I had never heard of that concept. But I learned in therapy that it is considered a form of sexual abuse because it damages a child's sexual development, and that's really kind of how we define sexual abuse, is mistreatment that harms the relationship that the kid has with their body, with their gender, with their sexuality, with intimacy. And so, of course, that can happen through physical sexual abuse, but there also is non-physical things that can abuse the child in a sexual nature. Or adults. I do usually talk about it from the perspective of a child, just because that was my experience, but I have read passages from this book, Silently Seduced, which talks about emotional incest, which the concept of emotional incest, sometimes called covert incest, is something that I had heard about before I ever started therapy, just kind of like cultural osmosis. I had heard of that somehow, but I always was super confused about why it has incest in the name if it doesn't have to be overtly sexual. I thought that's a really disgusting misuse of that word. But I've come around to understanding that the reason it's used is that even in emotional incest situations where the parent doesn't have sexualized feelings for her child, it still causes sexual wounds for the child. It still causes sexual trauma. And that's basically because if an adult doesn't have appropriate boundaries with their child, which is what covert incest is they're kind of treating their child like a surrogate spouse. Sometimes I call it spouseification or partnerification. That does cause the child to learn really bad things about boundaries or lack of boundaries. They learn a really kind of severe form of enmeshment. Emotional incest, the parent is using the child to meet their own needs for intimacy, emotional support, something that really should belong to their partner. But so, one example of emotional incest is when a parent treats their child kind of like a therapist, or like a little confidant. And in that type of dynamic, the parent doesn't have to be sexually attracted to their own child, and doesn't have to be saying or doing sexually creepy things to their child. But just by the nature of oversharing their own personal life and their personal problems, their emotional problems with their child, that lack of boundaries creates a kind of independence wound and exposes a child to a level of adult experience adult emotions that really wounds them and makes them grow up too fast and impacts their ability to do things like set boundaries, to see themselves as an individual person with individual needs. And that ends up impacting them in intimacy ways or sexual ways. If that doesn't immediately make sense to you, I get it, because it took me a while to wrap my head around that, especially when it's not creepy type behavior from the parent. But I have several videos where I've read passages from that book that kind of help piece that together if you want to go back and find those. But I do try to use hashtags emotional incest or covert incest when sharing passages from this book. So maybe if you search that way, they would come up. But also, like, just to be clear, my situation is kind of weird in that I was covertly sexually abused, but did not experience emotional incest. With emotional incest comes kind of putting the child on a pedestal and treating them very special, which is a really hard part of that wound for covert incest victims. Is on one hand they kind of felt like a little princess or a little king or like extremely special, and then on the other hand this was happening at the same time as they were being used and mistreated, and so that can prevent them from seeing their own wound for a long time because it's so wrapped up in feeling special. This book was recommended to me by my couples therapist, who knew that I experienced verbal sexual abuse, and usually verbal sexual abuse or other types of non-contact sexual abuse, especially from a parent or step-parent, does go hand in hand with emotional incest, but I just kind of ended up being somewhat of an outlier case. But I've still just been fascinated in emotional incest because I see it pretty commonly around me, and so I've been reading passages from that book for people who are interested. But just kind of like off the top of my head, other types of non-contact sexual abuse would be if a parent is oversharing their own sexual experiences. So you have like a single parent who is like occasionally going on dates and then comes home and tells you about making out with somebody, or just shares their sex life with you, even if they're still married to your parent. If they overshare with you about their like loneliness or sexual needs. If a parent is overly invested in the child's intimate life, so if there's like a lack of boundaries with letting a kid have their own private life, failing to give children privacy at age appropriate points. So of course when children are really little it's normal to bathe them, but it could be a form of sexual abuse to still bathe a child once they're past the age to where they could shower independently if you like insist on bathing them. As children grow up, they have a true need for separation, for privacy, and so parents who don't allow that, who force enmeshment, that becomes a sexual wound. There's lots of others, but hopefully that gives you a rough idea. And again, it's basically any kind of mistreatment towards a child that is going to impact their healthy sexual identity and sexual development. Things like purity culture can also be included. That's a big one in my